Beyond the Desert Gate, Chapter 7, Decimus. It was a fine night, late in the winter, almost moonless, but with enough light from the cold stars to show the roofs of the houses and, above them, the higher walls of the citadel. Lucia was sitting with Xenos and Conan in their room, huddled round a small charcoal brazier. The tiny lamp did not give enough light for her to sew, so for once her stiff hands were quiet. It was a night like so many during the last 2 months when the Romans had been in the house. Their cook was singing next door in the kitchen, and from the noise it sounded as if the tribune was out, and the centurion, Decimus, was getting drunk again. There was no point in even trying to sleep yet. "I think he's worse tonight," said Conan. "Then he won't be long. He'll go to sleep suddenly as usual, and then it'll be quiet again." Although the tribune Gallienus was in command at first, the wound that had kept him behind in Philadelphia had caused him too much pain to let him undertake the day-to-day running of the depot. The family had seen far more of Decimus, and his moods had come to have the same effect as the weather in their lives. They could not be controlled, but they affected the ease or the difficulty with which things could be done. Decimus did not like Philadelphia. He had been losing steadily at dice for days, and there was not enough work for his men. It had been a cold and wet winter. Most of the troops left in the city had been sick or wounded, only fit for light duties, so the centurion could not even give himself the satisfaction of the merciless drilling that would have put an edge on his command, sufficient to make the legate's eye gleam if he came back this way. Lucia cocked an ear at the noise from the other courtyard. "That was loud. Poor Philo. I hope Decimus isn't sick again." A voice called for the centurion's batman. "That's it," said Conan. "Bedtime all around." Philo, standing beside a smoking table lamp in which a fly had just drowned, was thinking the same thing. The dining room seemed murky, the air almost too thick to breathe, heavy with smells of meat fat, sweat, and wine. A Roman dinner was so different from the dignified way his father had entertained that it was impossible to believe it had been in the same room where he waited now as a servant. Then Decimus's head went down among the nutshells and grape skins, and an almost audible sigh came from the other servants. "Here we go again." 2 of the junior officers present hoisted the big man up and frog-marched him out into the cooler air outside. "Right," said Fulvius, the mess steward. "Now, don't break those cups in the rush. They're genuine Corinthian, and the tribune's fond of them." But even as Philo began to load his tray, there was the always ominous sound of quick hoofbeats outside in the road and a shout at the gate. Philo put down the cup he was holding and ran out into the courtyard. No, of course, that was silly. This was no homecoming, nothing that could mean anything good or bad for him. But he stayed all the same while the guard called for the officer on duty. He came, somewhat untidy, from Decimus's quarter. A dispatch rider had ridden into the yard. "Urgent message for the tribune," he said, not dismounting. "He's not here. He's gone out to dinner. Do we know where?" He looked around for Fulvius. "With Eupolemus the counselor, sir," said the guard, "but I'm not sure where his house is." Philo was tired. There was still work to do, but this might get him out of some of it. He stepped forward into the lamplight. "I know, sir." "Thank goodness for that, if the dispatch really won't wait." Philo went forward to take the rider's stirrup. It was a right turn out of the gateway, and hard to see where to put one's feet in the dark streets. He had not often been out so late, but in this company it was safe enough, and the city was very quiet. The horses' hooves slipped on the cobbles of the steep streets in the upper part of the citadel. On the brow of the hill was a small paved square with the portico of the temple of Zeus on one side and the council chamber on the other. In the faint light, the pillars of the temple were bone white, and In the corner of the steps was a dark hump that must be the beggar who was always there. 2 stray dogs barked at their heels, and a drunken man backed against a wall. Then they were going down the other side, and lights shone through the gateway of the house of Eupolemus. There were voices just inside. The tribune and the other guests were about to leave. The messenger swung down from his horse and threw the reins to Philo. Marius Gallienus, swarthy, tall, and only just beginning to lose his good looks, caught the flash of his helmet. "Over here, trooper." The man saluted and handed over the scroll. "Urgent, is it?" asked the tribune, raising an eyebrow. He limped back into the light as he unrolled it. Philo looked at the messenger and realized that he had the look of gloomy satisfaction that comes with the handing on of certain sorts of bad news. Then Gallienus made a sound, not much more than a drawing in of the breath, and put the scroll carefully away in the breast of his dress tunic. That means fancy tunic, his nice one. Slowly, he turned back towards his host and the other guests, still waiting uncertainly in the lighted doorway. His face showed nothing, but there was something suddenly formal about the way he held himself. "This news has traveled fast. Gentlemen, I have to tell you that the Emperor Vitellius is with the gods." It was only when Philo saw the shocked faces of the men in the lamplight that he understood that meant dead. But what came now? Vitellius had been the 3rd emperor since Nero had died the year before, names only, who had come and gone so quickly that here beyond the edge of the empire they had meant nothing. Nero had been there ever since the year Philo was born. His face was on the coins and the statues, but Galba, Otho, Vitellius, now the same wind had blown them all away, and the armies would already be marching again far away in Italy. And who wore the purple now? Eupolemus was asking the tribune that. Gallienus had a strange look on his face, as if the gravity due to the moment was losing a battle with excitement and anticipation. "Counselor, I know no more than you, but there may be more news soon, and it could be of particular interest to us here." Then he was in a hurry to be away. The messenger was dismissed to barracks, and Philo had to run to keep up behind Gallienus and his escort, not to be left alone in the streets at night. As they neared the house, he slipped off up the higher turning that led to the back wall, climbed it by a familiar ladder of rough stones and handholds, and dropped down into the storeyard. It should certainly be possible to escape further duties that night. The family rooms were quite quiet, and gentle snoring through the open door told him that Lucia was asleep. In the other room, Xenos sat up when he came in. "Philo, what was all that noise about? Not trouble?" "I don't know. Is it trouble when an emperor dies? We should be used to it by now." He understood now how the messenger had felt. That seemed to wake Conan too. "Vitellius?" "Well, there's only one emperor at the moment, isn't there?" said Philo wearily, prodding him to move over as he slid out of his tunic and sandals. "Probably not now," said Xenos thoughtfully. "And this news is more than a month old. I wonder which general was nearest Rome when it happened." Philo asked, "Why should it make any difference to us here, to our war? They won't all suddenly leave, will they?" "We'll know more in the morning," said Conan. Then, after a silence, "Titus, the legate Vespasian's son, left for Rome last month. I wonder if he was sniffing out how the land lay." It was quiet in the room, and Philo was almost asleep when Xenos said, very softly, "I remember when Nero died. I know I was shaken by it. It's as if I knew what his voice had been like. I wonder how." It was some time now since he had said anything like that. By an hour after dawn the next day, the news was all over the city. The counselors, anxious to do the right thing, met in an urgent session, ordered official mourning, and had funeral wreaths put on all the statues of the gods. The citizens enjoyed the excitement, and the Romans looked solemn. Philo's fellow servants spent most of the day discussing the donative that the new emperor, whoever he was, would make by custom to all serving troops when he assumed the purple. Like Xenos, they began to wonder which general had been nearest Rome, and if he was rich. Xenos woke in a strange mood. Usually, as soon as there was room to move, he set up his folding table and began the copying work that was now bringing him a small but steady income as his eyes grew stronger. Today, he knew that he could not settle to any work that would be worth paying for, and Conan understood that he wanted to be on his own and went out earlier than usual. Excuse me. The first month after the Romans had come had been worse for Conan. Philo was busy. Xenos had his copying, but what was he to do? How could he stand about in the marketplace talking to his friends with their plans for work and study when he had no money in his pocket and nothing to look forward to? Now he was the one who had to run Lucia's errands, and after Jason had caught him once hurrying up to the back of the house carrying 2 squawking hens, he had to try to keep away from the laughter and the pitying glances. He had spent some time on the Citadel Hill watching the building of the new temple. That was something that had always fascinated him. He loved beautiful things, clean lines, the look of a new statue, and the stonemasons had got to know him. In the yard, where the capitals for the columns and figures for the pediment were being carved, he was safe from mocking eyes. For the last month, he had been helping the sculptor who was making a statue of the emperor, which would stand in the square outside. So far he was not being paid, but he was coming home tired and with his hair full of marble dust and sleeping better. And Lucia and Xenos had exchanged relieved glances. "Wait a minute. Don't take your cloak off," said Cleis, the sculptor, as Conan came into the yard. He was not a Greek, but a Syrian from Antioch, with no great opinion of himself as an artist. He could produce a standard statue of a god or an emperor, and if it was not a very good likeness, no people knew any better anyway. "What do you want?" Conan asked. "It's the drapery over the left arm. There was a fault in the stone, and the edge had split off. I shall have to change it. No, stand still while I see how your cloak hangs." It was cold standing, and Conan looked longingly across at the column base he was being allowed to work on with Cleis's chisel. "What about the news, then?" asked Cleis, whistling through his teeth. "What news? Oh, the emperor, you mean. I suppose that's why you left the head till last. Now who will you have to put on it?" "Ah, that's the question. And of course, I left the head on purpose. I wasn't born yesterday. Got caught that way in Caesarea once. I expect the council will be along pretty quick with further orders once they know." He stood back and looked at the figure. "I knew a god guided me not to make him too tall. Not that they notice. Patrons. Make the figure tall, it shows respect. But Vespasian's only a little man, and he's stocky. I'm going to have my work cut out." "Vespasian?" "That's what they're saying here in the market, hadn't you heard? Then Titus, his son, will be back here to Judea as soon as it's safe to sail, and I wouldn't be a Jew in Jerusalem by midsummer for all the corn in Egypt. All right, I've got it. Now you can get on with your work." Conan had only been working long enough to warm himself up when there was the sound of voices in the gateway to the yard. Even with his back turned, he recognized Eupolemus the counselor. The regular chinking of hammers from the other masons stopped, but Conan kept his head down, crouching over his work. He had heard Jason's laugh. It was as Cleis had expected, tactful orders to carry on with the other work till the city was sure. Then a shadow fell across the dusty, stone-chipped ground where Conan was kneeling. "It can't be! Why, Conan, is this where you're hiding?" Jason, tall and beautifully dressed, was at his most charming, but already the story, as it would be told in the scent shop in the market later that morning, was being embroidered in his mind. Conan stood up and dusted his hands on the seat of the old tunic he wore for work, At least he was as tall as Jason. I thought you were in Antioch by now. Hard luck, your father keeping you hanging around here when you must be keen on doing something yourself. Are the roads north not safe? Things weren't too bad when I went to Gerasa, but of course that was last summer. Jason's eyes narrowed, though the smile stayed. He was about to start on a long and clearly amusing account of his own future when his father called him. The relief showed a little too clearly. As they left the yard, Eupolemus seemed to be complaining about his son disturbing workmen, and Jason's clear voice drifted back. Oh, that wasn't a proper workman. Didn't you recognize Apollodorus' son? What a come-down. Conan hit clumsily with his mallet and struck his thumb. The pain gave his eyes a reason to water. Toward midday, Xenos came out of his room, too restless any longer to try to pretend that he was working. The store yard was out of the wind, and Philo was sitting on a bench against the wall, enjoying the quiet hour before he would have to help serve the Tribune's lunch. It's going to be hot here as soon as there's any real sun, Philo said. We shall have to try to fix up some sort of shelter. Wasn't there a roll of matting that Conan didn't throw away? Where did he put it? Said Xenos, glad of anything to distract himself. Isn't it in the covered shed past the stable? He went out into the main yard, dodging the horses of the Tribune's guard, who were being led out for exercise. There seemed to be more people about than usual. He found what he wanted after some poking around. Then he wondered if he could carry it. The roll was half rotten and started to unroll, and his fingers made larger holes than there were already as he tried to grip it tightly. He nearly left it and went for help, but something stubborn inside him wanted to do as simple a thing as this on his own for once. He blundered out into the yard, not able to see properly where he was going, and hoping he would not put his feet in the fresh horse muck. It was an angry shout close in front of him that stopped him dead and caused him finally to lose his grip on the matting. It fell in folds over his own feet and those of the man who had shouted, and as he bent to catch hold of the ends, he was aware of high-laced army sandals and a red tunic. Even as the voice roared at him again, right into his face, and he looked up at the furious Decimus picking straw off his tunic, his mind jarred and seemed to turn as violently in his head as the heart does when it misses a beat. Decimus was shouting at him, and Philo was suddenly there, trying to brush him down and getting cuffed for his trouble. Xenos murmured something, he did not know what, for this had happened before, and he knew where. He turned blindly and stumbled into their room, leaving the matting lying in the courtyard. Lucia, looking up from her cooking, stared after him in alarm. What did the centurion say? She asked Philo. Xenos seems so upset. Nothing much. It was just one of his usual bellows. It was mild for him, really, because he did look funny with the straw sticking all over him. He came back an hour later to find Lucia still alone and no sign of Xenos. Do you think I ought to see if he's all right? He asked. Lucia looked doubtfully at the curtained doorway. There's been no sound from inside. Perhaps he's asleep. Then it won't hurt to look. Philo drew a corner of the curtain aside, trying not to let too much light into the room, but Xenos was not asleep. He was sitting on the bed, staring down at his hands, and when the shaft of light moved across the floor and he looked up, Philo noticed that although it had not reached his face, there seemed something like a glow about it. Then Xenos looked at him, smiled, and spoke gently in a voice that was unlike any Philo had heard him use before. My name is Hylas, and my God has found me.